LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty, and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Dmitry Orlov, who joins us to discuss his book, Shrinking the Technosphere, Getting a Grip on the Technologies that Limit Our Autonomy, Self-sufficiency and Freedom. Over the past 2 centuries, we have witnessed the wholesale replacement of most previous methods of conducting both business and daily life with new, technologically advanced, more efficient methods. But what exactly is progressive or efficient about this new arrangement is hardly ever examined in depth. If the new ways of doing things are so much better, then we must all be leading relaxed, stress-free, enjoyable lives with plenty of free time to devote to art and leisure activities. But a more careful look at these changes shows us that the rapidly evolving brave new world of gadgets, gizmos, and constant connectivity is instead a metastasising matrix of manipulation and control in which we have become slaves to money and machines. Creeping ever closer to outright omniscience, the technosphere is an emergent intelligence in its own right. The harm to environment, society and our individual lives is plain to see, but is brushed off amid hollow mantras about productivity, progress and the graven idol of economic growth. Shrinking the Technosphere guides readers through the process of bringing technology down to a manageable number of carefully chosen, essential, well understood and controllable elements. It is about regaining the freedom to use technology for our own benefit and is critical reading for all who seek to get back to a point where technologies assist us rather than control us. The end game of the Technosphere is total domination. The outcome will be total destruction. But can humanity take back control before digital Armageddon finally dawns? Hello and welcome, Dmitry, and thank you so much for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Great to be with you.
Okay, Dmitry, today we're going to be talking about your latest book. It is entitled Shrinking the Technosphere, Getting a Grip on the Technologies that Limit Our Autonomy, Self-sufficiency and Freedom. Before we dive into all of that, just give listeners a bit of information about your background and your work in general.
I was born in Leningrad, USSR. I left as a teenager. I received a lot of education and training in the United States, became an engineer, then got a degree in applied linguistics, and worked a series of corporate jobs, tech startups mostly. Went to Russia starting in '89 for several extended visits and watched what was going on there in the '90s and afterwards. So I really have a foot in both worlds, if you will. And about 10 years ago, I made a drastic change and just dropped out of the corporate realm and set off sailing and have been exploring alternative ways of living ever since then and making a bit of money by writing and editing and publishing books. So that's where I am now.
Okay, well, that being said, it will become obvious then as we work through this that you're kind of walking the walk as laid out in your book and indeed some of your other writings. As the title indicates, this is mainly about technology, and getting a grip on it implies that there might be a problem here. So just to get us started, if you could set out for folks a basic potted definition of the technosphere as you see it, versus the biosphere, which is a phrase most people will be familiar with, because we are actually in fact now dependent on both. The biosphere, most people would say, well, yes, of course. The technosphere, most people not so sure about, but as you've made clear in the book, we are extremely dependent on it, and that in itself is a big problem.
Well, yes, the technosphere is not just an extension of the natural realm, the living planet on which we depend for breathable air and water that we can drink and all the food that we can eat. All of that comes from the living planet. And instead it tries to replace it. And it provides us with a lot of services. One of the things that it has been doing extremely well is providing for an ever-increasing human population with the help of fossil fuels. So we're, in effect, we're eating fossil fuels. We derive about 90% of the calories that we eat from fossil fuels and just 1% from sunlight, which is dramatic. The best way to look at the technosphere is as a machine. It's sort of it has some aspects to it that are sort of like artificial intelligence, but it is just it's a mechanism. It's a machine. You could call it an emergent intelligence because it has its own agenda separate from the human agenda. It keeps us alive, but it also can very easily kill us, and in fact it does. Most of the most advanced technologies are dedicated for killing humans specifically. So it can kill vast numbers of us just as easily. And it has convinced us that we are in charge. That is sort of a theatrical suspension of disbelief that it cultivates in us. So we have this misplaced sense of agency. We feel that we're in control, whereas we're not in control at all. And that is something to understand. And basically we're being kept alive by this thing that will eventually kill us and kill most other living things because of various blind spots that it has. It's mentally deficient, if you will. It is intelligent, but it is an idiot savant. It's mentally deficient. It can't see physical limits, for instance. It can't see its own limitations. Various other problems with it. So I've backed away from saying we are in charge, we humans control nature, and instead describe this mechanism that is controlling us alongside much of nature at this point, and went forward and tried to figure out what is technology and how is that separate from this entity, this emergent entity that is currently in charge. How can we get rid of it? How can we shrink it? How can we liberate ourselves from it?
Well, to some people this will be sounding extremely science fiction-like. Certainly since the earliest days of science fiction, there was an idea of technology run amok and what the future might bring. For every sort of Star Trek vision of the future, there was a nightmarish dystopian one. But it all seems, again, very remote because a lot of the technology spoken about in early sci-fi, nothing like it really existed in the real world. And it was easy for people to kind of pretend that, well, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it or worry about that if it happens. And then suddenly, well, it's like boiling the frog slowly in the pot, isn't it? But how did this kind of come about? The way you describe it in the book, it sounds absolutely suicidal on our part. At what point did technology, was this always inevitable, or at what point did technology flip over from being something that we were using to serve ourselves and we were seeing tangible benefits from? We think of some early technologies that were a real boon for humanity, and it became something that we were kind of enslaved by. Can you point to something in particular, a phase, a point in time, a period in time?
Oh, absolutely. First of all, we're technological beings. We were preceded in evolution by other hominids that also used tools. They made sharp implements out of stone and made lots of things using those out of bone, wood, other materials, leather. So we are technological beings. We depend on having tools and technologies for making shelter, for cooking our food, for making clothing, for defending ourselves against wild animals and each other. So those are all essential technologies without which we cannot survive. But the technosphere, it took off with the discovery of fossil fuels that could be exploited on a vast industrial scale, and it gave it access to virtually limitless for the time being amounts of energy at very low cost. So the payoff was huge, and that allowed it to breed a gigantic human population. If you look at fossil fuel consumption and population, they track each other. And that is going to run its course. So basically, now the technosphere is approaching a point in time where it will be in extremis. It will be devouring itself and us alongside with us, because the energy from fossil fuels is still plentiful, but most of that energy gets plowed right back into getting more fossil fuels. The energy return on energy invested in fossil fuel exploration and production is approaching the limit beyond which industrial activity becomes impossible. So the question is, well, we know that a lot of people will die as a result of that, because people are actually eating fossil fuels. If it weren't for fossil fuels, they would be starving. But the question is, can any of us survive this transition to this post-industrial, post-fossil fuel state? Keeping in mind that most other non-renewable natural resources are at a point where it takes increasing amount of energy to get them out of the ground and processed, and that energy isn't going to be available either.
Now, a lot of people have written about the idea of a fall in terms of humankind at some point, generally speaking in the very distant past, that we took some kind of wrong turn. Some people have pointed to the development of agriculture, but basically something happened that put us on this track. And I don't know if you're in your mind, we can go that far back, but there's certainly, when we look back at the rise and fall of civilizations and empires through as much of history as we can say anything really certain about, or have some sort of solid speculation about, there's this form of insanity that seems to grip humanity that doesn't seem to apply to the rest of the natural world. And when you describe the technosphere and the phase it's moving into now, it almost seems possessed of the same kind of insanity, that, the self-destructive craziness, because dependent on fossil fuels as it is, even if in the wildest realms of sci-fi, if the technosphere somehow did decouple, a bit like in the Matrix films, as it was trying to do, from humanity altogether and become somehow sentient or independent, barring going on to other planets. And you do actually touch upon this in the book, in the search for more resources, and it would eat itself. It would self-destruct as well.
Well, I don't really buy into any of the sci-fi visions. Those are, to me, a realm of useless fiction. There are types of fiction that are very useful, especially, it's very difficult to write nonfiction in ways that meaningfully explores human relationships. So that is very useful, where fiction is a useful approach. But describing, imaginary technological realms is, to me, just masturbation. So basically, sci-fi to me is intellectual masturbation of some sort, and I just basically won't go near it. But in terms of the progression, well, initially we were these, happy hominids just kind of wandering around, very few of us in any given space, tribal, basically little bands and tribes of maybe a couple of hundred individuals at most. And we were the top predator. We ate all the best that we could find. We had plenty. We didn't spend a lot of time working. We worked maybe an hour a day to get everything we needed. And the rest of the time was devoted to play or rest or whatever we wanted. Having sex has been a favorite with our species for a long time. But eventually we got ourselves into a trap where we increased our numbers by decreasing the quality of the inputs. So instead of eating all kinds of wild products that we really enjoyed, we started eating just a few staples like potatoes or something like that to keep ourselves alive, or grain, and devoted all of our time to cultivating these few staples. Our health suffered, our brains shrunk in size, and then eventually we turned it over to machines. So now we can't even survive without all kinds of machinery to keep us alive. and our ability to provide for ourselves has shrunk even more. And now people have lost even the abilities that they've developed. They can't spell because of spell checkers. They can't count or do mental arithmetic because of calculators. They can't remember where they're going because of GPS. They can't remember each other's phone numbers because those are now stored in the smartphone. And it goes on and on and on. So eventually we become these useless blobs that are just attached to some machine. And if that machine stops working, we die. That's the progression of humanity. That's the fall.
I don't know exactly what age you are, but we're not a million years apart. Let's just put it that way. And yet I remember certainly from the Jetsons type future that we were promised in the post-war period. But when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, the future was a bright and shiny place, and technology was going to be an extension of our humanity. It was going to make us superhuman in some ways, whether it would be extending our lives, curing terminal diseases, resulting in an age of leisure where we would sit around in the park reading poetry and drinking wine while machines did all the grubby stuff that we didn't want to do anymore. Then the next thing would be, reaching out into the stars. Technology was not supposed to be a limiting thing. It was supposed to be a liberating thing. And I suppose it is one other insidious aspect of the technosphere then that has now become very, very evident, although a lot of people still don't see it, is not just a limitation in terms of time wasting and, new technology coming along, which is actually inferior to previous technology, but the fact that we have, the edge of leisure never arrived, that we aren't populating other planets. And actually, if you go back and, look again at some of the promises that were made, a lot of it in the realms of speculation, but, we fully expected domed cities and bubble cars and day trips to the moon by the year 2000. Well, I certainly did anyway. And, they're conspicuous by their absence.
Well, we're not going to other planets because the moment we get out of the ionosphere of our planet, we die from radiation exposure. So we're not going anywhere. All of space exploration is basically, circling the planet at a low altitude and a few trips to the moon that may have been faked, depending on who you hear talk about it. There are a few discrepancies here and there that pop up that may indicate that the whole trip to the moon was staged. So we're not going anywhere. So all of that is just complete nonsense. All of the space exploration is, like I said, mental masturbation. But what has actually been happening is we've been tweaked, if you will, by this mechanistic intelligence. So there's some optimum, which is a human living in a cage, but thinking that he's free. So that has been the impetus, is put us in ever smaller cages, provide us with an ever smaller assortment of goods and services, if you will. Basically, all we have now is data piped in, and everything we eat is basically, in the United States at least, GMO soy and corn, which is just basically, two artificial species that we are now being fed. And it doesn't matter that this will drive us to extinction. And, we'll be biologically extinct in a few generations if we keep going this way. Because it's all a matter of control. We're being very tightly controlled. And eventually if we obey the machine, which has its own prerogatives, we'll just become useless lab animals. We'll be there to be experimented on and then dismissed.
A lot of people that I've known for a long time, including some close friends, are very resistant to any talk of technology delivering diminishing returns for them in their personal lives or for us as a species, whatever level you want to pitch it at. Never mind that it could be such a vast problem along the lines that you describe. In the first chapter of the book, you set out some areas in our daily lives in which this is starting to impinge, not even starting, it's impinging terribly, and things are getting worse. Pick one, two, however, just a handful from that if you wish, to give people listening who are perhaps just dismissive at this point a flavour of how this is actually affecting them. This is not an abstract conversation that we're having here. We're not engaging in a TED talk or something like that.
Well, what you indicate is actually a big problem that limits the effectiveness of my approach, which is, write a book, give a few talks, etc. The brainwash is very effective. People are very much convinced that newer technology is better than older technology, that more technology is better than less technology, that anybody who stands in the way of more, better, newer technology is basically some kind of Luddite and should be ignored. And what that points to is that, people have been manipulated to a point where they're just basically projections or extensions of the technosphere. Not only do they have no agency, they can't influence the course of events. They will basically absorb any bit of technology that comes their way. But they're not really even capable of that agency if it were given to them, because they don't even understand what's happened to them. And it's useless to explain to people because they'll just talk back. People have to discover this for themselves. This is not a task that I will take on, is convincing people that they have it bad.
There's a few other aspects to this. In fact, if you start to look at popular culture and the media and all sorts of experts and professors and talking heads giving us information through all different channels, all different aspects of the direction that the world is going, economy, energy, environment, that when you begin to look at them through the lens that you are, for example, you begin to see aspects of the technosphere that take on a very different flavor. So we've got limited time today, but I'm just going to pull out a couple of the bigger ones, and you can perhaps give us your thoughts on it from this technosphere perspective. First one I'm going to talk about is energy. For example, you mentioned fossil fuels, this thing that the technosphere is powered by. That's a relatively recent development in terms of human history. We're now hearing a lot about the future of energy, specifically whether it's nuclear or renewables, and these are touted as essential to our future. That's not the future of technology as such, but you and I and all our friends and family, everyone we know and everyone on the planet. But this is almost like a press release from Technosphere Central. How do you perceive our energy future from that perspective? Because when you do look at it in the cold light of day, nuclear or renewables or anything else that appears to be on the table or coming down the pipeline, pardon the pun, are not going to be able to sustain the technosphere in the, how shall I put it, style to which it has become accustomed.
Well, yes. One of the glaring mental deficits of the technosphere as an emergent intelligence is that it is incapable of perceiving physical limits. Whenever some resource runs low, its reaction is to throw more energy and more effort at exploiting it. So, for instance, if whales become harder to fish, you build more whaling boats. If fish stocks run low, you build bigger fishing boats and use more technology to find the remaining fish to make sure you don't miss any. If the ocean freight industry is not generating the profits that it has to sustain itself, the solution is to build even bigger ships, super Panamax ships, and and increase the size of the Panama Canal and consider building other canals. And that is the typical approach. So, for instance, oil became a problem because the conventional oil production, it peaked in 2005-06. So instead of saying, okay, well, we don't have enough oil anymore, we have to stop using so much energy. The solution, quote unquote, was to run up huge debts and to use that money to get at the dregs, which is stuff like fracking, shale oil, tar sands, deep offshore, even Arctic oil, which is super expensive to exploit. And that is the typical thing, is the technosphere cannot see limits. Now, in terms of renewables and nuclear, that's an entire fictional realm. The nuclear fusion area is specifically, very high profile. It's the energy of the future and always will be, as the saying goes. There is no reason to believe that anything having to do with that will ever be scaled up on the time scale during which oil supplies will run disastrously short. It takes 30, 50 years. Once you have a working prototype, to build something and put it into actual production. That's not going to happen. In terms of conventional fission reactors, well, look at Fukushima Daiichi. The problem with that technology is that it's incomplete. We know how to build these reactors, but we don't know how to clean them up once they blow up, which they do. And all of the reactors that we've built along the shorelines, in seismic zones, we have no way of cleaning them up. Already we're poisoning the Pacific Ocean with radiation. And we may, if we pursue the nuclear option, we may end up poisoning ourselves to the point where no human survives to adulthood. So that would be how we go extinct, because of high cancer rates from radiation and nuclear contamination. So none of those options are the least bit realistic, and the reason that they're pushed upon us is because what's really the case, the real story is inadmissible, because it requires us to admit that there are limits that cannot be solved through innovation or through throwing more resources or through debt financing or government subsidies or anything of the sort.
So we shouldn't be surprised, really, if we're looking at it from this alternate perspective that you say is inadmissible, that when you cross there from energy over into the environment, that the solution, so-called, to these predicaments is always a technological one. It's like, whether we got an environmental mess, technology will come along to solve that. If that's been caused by dirty energy, well, then technology will come along to solve that. What about the economics of all this? The sort of the big Ponzi scheme of the money system, which is detached from, has been for a long time, from resources. I mean, that's an important element in all this. Is it less easy to sort of say, oh, well, no matter what happens with the banking system, there'll be a technological fix? How do you see that playing out? What warning signs should we be looking for there?
Well, economics can be useful. There used to be a class taught in high schools in the United States called home economics, and once upon a time, girls were specifically required to take those classes. So on that level, economics is useful. On the level where theoreticians use mathematical techniques to make these untestable arguments, theories about how the world functions. First of all, it's not predictive, so it's not the science. Secondly, it is based on some logical fallacies and circular reasoning. So it is not even, a valid intellectual pursuit. And it's really the propaganda arm of the technosphere to a large extent. I would say that if we are to survive, we have to get back to where the economy, as we think about it, involves us, our families, and our neighbors. That's it. What this economy has to do is provide us with everything we need to survive. That is, we have to stop paying for energy, for food, for transportation. We have to demonetize our lives. And that is our economic future, if we have one, if we have any sort of future at all.
Well, we'll definitely, when we get towards the end of our talk, we'll definitely get onto some solutions, or some ideas at least, for how we might try to make our way out of this morass. But the media's got a lot to answer for here. I touched upon this earlier, because it's, for those of us, most of us who are not doing our own primary research or not thinking for ourselves, we're getting fed down a pipeline through the tube, on the airwaves, to the internet, whatever, how things are, what's happening, what's going to happen, what's possible and what isn't. And thinking about limits got me to thinking about population. That is an issue in itself. We hear a lot about that in terms of it's a problem. Other commentators saying it's not a problem. Clearly it is. But of course, again, there's going to be a techno fix for it, isn't there? Well, maybe not. But in politics at the moment, there is a lot of emphasis on terms such as diversity, multiculturalism. Immigration is a hot button issue, has been for the last several years, particularly in Europe. It's now hitting headlines since the election of Trump in the States. Can you speak to any of that on any level that you think is relevant? Because I just think that in all of that, there's a lot that can be mined about the situation if we can get below the surface.
Yes, well, there is a sort of inspirational undercurrent, if you will, is still alive among some part of humanity, where people have a connection to the land. They know how to inhabit the landscape. They are faithful custodians of the natural realm around them. They have a connection to each other that is, in some sense, tribal. They have a connection that comes from spending your entire life with a relatively small group of people whom you know personally. This all happens away from big cities. I've been spending quite a lot of time in a small town in the South, and here everybody greets each other. Like it's impolite to just walk past a person without at least nodding. If you know them by name, you have to greet them by name, and that is standard. So there's that sort of humanity, right? And then there are the big cities, which are anonymous, and where it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter what your cultural background is, it doesn't matter whether you're culturally compatible. All of your kids are thrown together and taught the same pablum. Their minds are poisoned with the same thing. So what they end up is these generic, denatured humans that have been fed this mass culture that has nothing to do with anyone, and they have no connection to anything at all. They're basically living in some concrete box, and they go outside and they walk on tarmac and maybe see a tree because there's a bit of quote unquote landscape. That's not landscaping. That's not even nature. So they have no contact with nature at all. So that's been the thrust. The technosphere likes to genericize humans. One size fits all, because that's more efficient. So mixing it up is very useful. So if you have some population group that has a strong tribal identity, they will insist on making arrangements that suit them specifically. That's inefficient. But if you mix it up, if you throw in a bunch of Christians and a bunch of Muslims and tell them that nobody's really in charge, then you can feed them whatever. You can feed them standard product offerings, and they'll have no choice but to accept it.
And this would explain the demonization of points of view, like the one you've just put across, trying to make it sound like people making these points are small-minded or racist, xenophobic, whatever it happens to be, that, if we can't all get along, and there's nothing wrong with getting along, by the way, it doesn't have to be all-out war or all-out integration, but this generally accounts for the fact that you can almost not say these words, you can almost not bring up the discussion that we're having in the mainstream media.
Well, the cat is out of the bag, unfortunately. And a lot of people are losing their minds because of that. You see, if you look at Trump's victory, right? Well, he didn't win by a large amount in terms of the actual popular vote. He didn't win at all. Although if you take out California, then he did. California is sort of a special case. But in general, if you look at the electoral map of the United States, the map went for Trump, and the people who voted for Clinton are concentrated in a few large cities. So they're not diffused across the landscape. So if you can think about it this way, basically there are these large concentration camps that the technosphere runs. They're called cities, and they're inhabited by people who are very tightly controlled by the technosphere. It is possible for the technosphere to tell them exactly how to vote. They're like lab animals that respond to mass media stimuli. They're like trained rats that walk into a voting booth and pull the right lever based on mass media stimuli, just like a lab rat will pull a lever to expecting a food pellet to come out. And the rest of the country here is not buying it. They've figured out that the politicians are all lying. They say one thing, they get elected, they do another thing completely. So they don't expect the politicians to serve them. They also know that the mass media is lying to them. They just don't believe a word of it anymore. And so they're pretty much in open rebellion, and they will not listen. They will not listen to experts, to talking heads, to academics. They refuse. And that is a huge loss of control on the part of, the denizens of the technosphere clustered in big cities. And as a result of that, they've gone insane. So now everybody is, is Hitler. Everybody is a Nazi. Anybody who doesn't follow the prescribed narrative is automatically a Nazi, right? So where does the discussion go from there? The answer is there is no discussion. It doesn't go anywhere. You can stand around and call people Nazis all you want. People won't listen to you, and that is the point in time where we are now, where basically the fiction that was democratic politics doesn't exist anymore. It's broken down. People are looking at it and saying, no, this is just some machine making you say things, and I'm not listening.
Well, as you say, the cat is out of the bag, and one does not have to be a Trump supporter. One does not have to be a fan of the fact that the United Kingdom recently voted to depart the European Union. You don't have to like any of the developments along these lines. The fact remains that we're going to see more of this. So God only knows, people who are currently going berserk on social media or whatever, or in the general media about these developments, how they're going to feel next year, 5 years from now, a decade from now. This is not a blip. This is the wave of the future.
Yes, it is, and it is accompanied by the psychological breakdown, because see, the fictional narrative is that you get to decide something, that your opinions matter, right? That you're progressive and enlightened and educated, and that people who disagree with you because they're less progressive, less enlightened, uneducated, and have fascist tendencies. So that's what people have been taught, and that is not really what's real. What's real is that what they do doesn't matter. Their opinions make no difference at all. They have been manipulated into a position which they can either accept or be banished, be shunned by civilized, progressive, liberal society, and they can't do that. And so they have absolutely no options. But as the world changes around them, and as more and more people basically, flee and find that, they have a better chance of surviving with some group that, isn't like them at all. There's a psychotic break that happens, and I see that all the time. I'm basically, right now, I'm pretty much ignoring all of the anti-Trump hysteria, because it is just hysteria. It's just people who've gone insane, and it might be catchy, I don't even want to hear what they have to say at this point, because it never mattered what they said. Their opinion never mattered. And now it's basically just insane ranting and raving.
Given your background, can I get you to say something about the role of Russia and Putin in terms of current geopolitics and the wider predicament that we're facing? There's a very interesting and eye-opening section in your book on all of this.
Well, yes, a lot of it has to do with the mass media in the West, which is owned by just a handful of oligarchs. Those oligarchs, are wedded to the technosphere in the sense that, they're just giant bags of money. They're giant bags of abstract wealth, and such vast sums of abstract wealth are controlled by an army of technocrats. So that is almost like entering the mind of the technosphere itself. And all of these people absolutely hate. All of these oligarchs absolutely hate Putin for a very simple reason. He limited their power. Before he came to power in Russia, Russia was basically being actively dismantled, sold for parts by an oligarchy that basically stole what previously belonged to the people, privatized it, and then sold it off piece by piece. So the country was being robbed. And Putin actually turned that around. He restored Russia's sovereignty, and he gave the people once again a chance to make a life for themselves. As a result of that, he became tremendously popular compared to the popularity of politicians in the West, which is vanishingly small at this point, he's incredibly popular, and so it is obvious that he would have a target painted on him by the mass media in the West. I understand that not as a question of expressing opinion. I see that as a mechanism. I see that as something that can only function in a certain way. Basically, Putin is sort of like an obstacle, an immovable object. So, it creates an impediment to have a politician like that in charge of a gigantic, vast, resource-rich country. So they've been grinding away at him, but that's not been working. So that is yet another aspect of the ever widening circle of failure that we've been witnessing, political, economic, social failure in the West. I think that this demonization campaign has largely run its course because you hear one thing from if you listen to politicians or talking heads on mass media, etc., you get a completely different perspective if you actually talk to people, which I do a lot. Nobody in the United States particularly dislikes Russia or dislikes Putin. Russia is a pretty popular country. For any number of reasons, but all of this demonization, it's just not working.
From your perspective, I don't like to use the word ordinary when talking about people because what does that mean? And we all have the potential to be extraordinary, but if you talk to a guy on the streets of Russian towns and cities, are they pretty positive about their fellow human beings over in the USA? Do they recognize them as people with the same wants, needs, desires, basically the same, but they're just being sat upon by this technosphere and the human enablers of it?
Well, the popularity of the United States in Russia fluctuates. So under Obama, the United States became very, very unpopular for any number of reasons. But now that Trump has been elected and is making much more agreeable noises towards Russia, there's a renewal of interest in the United States. The United States was seen as a role model in the 1990s after the Soviet Union collapsed. And the Russians found out a great deal about the United States. Americans don't know anything about Russia, but Russians know quite a lot about the United States. And that popularity ran its course. So at this point, there isn't a huge amount of interest in the United States. There isn't the feeling that Russia has anything to learn from the Americans. There's a feeling that Americans are, to a large extent, just a little bit degenerate. Like they're fat, they're lazy, they're violent. There's just like a lot wrong with them. And that it's better to just sort of, make peace with them, but not really have much to do with them.
Okay, Dmitry, well, in the final segment of the interview, we just turn to some ideas about what we can do as individuals, as groups, as communities, perhaps, to try and position ourselves rather better than we would be otherwise in all of this. In terms of our predicament, particularly on an individual level, family level, whatever, you talk about something called the Iron Triangle. Now, a lot of people will be familiar with that. And it basically speaks to how our everyday lives within the technosphere, our work and family and just everything from the 9 to 5 and even home life is orientated around it. That gives most people really quite a stiff challenge when it comes to trying to extricate themselves.
Well, yes, the Iron Triangle is that basically you need a place to live, and will pay any amount of money for it, even though all that you do is sleep there, maybe watch television, go to the bathroom, and people will pay half their income for just that. And then, of course, you can't work at home, so you have to drive somewhere in order to earn the money to pay for a place to live. And so you need a car. And of course you need a job because otherwise you won't have the money to pay for the car and the shelter that you need. So that's the iron triangle: job, transportation, and shelter. There are other ways to live. For instance, you could get a homestead that would provide you with all the fuel that you need wood, all the food that you need, that you eat, so vegetables, some grains, some livestock, and it'll provide you shelter that you can build yourself, including out of materials that just grow on site. And then you can render yourself relatively independent. So that's just one model. There are other models as well. There are various life hacks, I call them, that I describe in the book, which are basically ways of escaping the iron triangle. And a lot of people are doing it. They're keeping a low profile because, if the technosphere finds out, it brings down the hammer because it wants to keep everyone as a dependent. But a lot of people are doing it, and it is possible.
Now, there's something very important in what you just said there, and that's that a lot of people will listen to perhaps your description of an alternative way of living and think, it's the off-grid thing, it's solar panels on the roof and it's an electric car, or perhaps it's using recycled potato fry fat, to run the vehicle or whatever. But the popular off-grid thing that you see in magazines and that lifestyle, where essentially you keep the trappings of modern industrial civilization, but you just do it somewhere out in the woods, and you've got your flushing toilet and all the rest of it. That in itself, as you say, is raising a red flag for the technosphere and the human bureaucrats that administer all of that. And that isn't actually the sort of future you're talking about.
Well, yes. All of that sort of gizmo-based, product-based, off-grid homesteading is kind of like science fiction. It's sort of like you can also be like member of the Society for Creative Anachronism and dress up in medieval-looking clothing and wave a sword around. It's just as real as that. Okay, so solar panels are okay for maybe some LED lights, not even that, really. They're useful for communications equipment. So you need a battery to power a CB radio, so you can talk to your neighbors over citizens band. So for that you might use a solar panel and a little car battery and a charger. But beyond that, there are problems with solar, which is there's no way to store electricity, and you need to store it up during the summer so that you can spend it during the winter. And that doesn't work. So it's better to just have like a kerosene lantern or something. But most importantly, just do stuff when the sun is shining and go to sleep when it's dark. That's the key to not needing electricity. A lot of people in the United States specifically are homesteading incredibly successfully. There are hundreds of thousands of them. They've been doing it for many generations. Their numbers are steadily growing, and they're some of the healthiest, happiest, most independent people around. And they have won sufficient concessions from the government that they're pretty much left alone. There are the Anabaptists, the Amish, the Mennonites, and the Hutterites, and a few other groups, some Quakers amongst them. And their model actually works, and they've gotten rid of most industrial technology, and they're doing extremely well. And they actually, among the general population, they have the ability to sustain themselves no matter what happens.
What we call travelers sometimes would get called gypsies in mainland Europe, but people who just want to live free from the system. Sounds like a cliche, but they just want to do their own thing in their own time. They're not bothering anybody, but they're not going to be on the grid. They're not going to be filling out paperwork or whatever. They have been run to the ground, and most of them now live in the equivalent of Indian reservations. So I'm just wondering, the communities you're describing in the US, how they came to win their status and maintain it through all of this.
Oh, well, the Anabaptists, they came out of the Reformation. Their history is of monstrous abuse and martyrdom. Their history and their founding myths all have to do with being martyred. It is very important that they're willing to die for their faith. So they are a hard target.
Why were deals cut with these communities? Was it just not worth going after them? In any event, it's clear that 300 million Americans can't simply switch over to an Amish-style existence. The Technosphere probably can't crush everybody, but...
The crucifix is something useful. It has a function. It is very useful against possessed people, vampires, the tax collectors, and I guess it's useful against the Technosphere as well. So religious groups are actually quite powerful in ways that secular groups are not. They are a hard target for the Technosphere, and being this sort of mechanistic rational entity, it always does its cost-benefit analysis. And if it finds out that a certain group of people is too hard a target and there's nothing to be gained by starting a conflict with them, they'll be left alone. So that's really what happened. All of these Anabaptist groups are pretty much being left to their own devices and being provided with some sort of accommodation. For instance, the Hutterites, they refuse to serve in the military. All of these groups refuse to serve in the military. But during World War II, there was a general draft. And so the Hutterites got a dispensation from that where they went into the Forest Service, and contributed in that fashion, non-violently. And there are a lot of accommodations like that have been won, basically conflict avoidance, because with these groups that have this history of martyrdom, you don't really want to pick a fight with them because it's politically just too painful.
Maybe there's something for the rest of us to learn in there. It doesn't mean that we have to get religion or found a religion, but maybe if we're prepared to just not roll over for anything, if we actually have a line in the sand that we say enough's enough, that I want to live and I want to be happy and prosperous and, I want a future, but not at any cost. Whereas it seems that too many of us at the minute is kind of like, well, whatever flavor of bullshit you have this week, I'll suck that up. I'll suck that up. Just let me keep my apartment. Just let me keep my running water, whatever it happens to be,
Yes. Well, stealth is the better part of valor. A lot of people have this idea that, they have to do everything out in the open and publicly. And the opposite is the case. And then a lot of people think, well, what if everybody did that? Even though there's absolutely no reason to think that everybody will do anything. People keep saying, well, what can we do about the billions of people in the world? Not all Americans, not all 350 million Americans or however many there are could possibly live like that. Well, there's no danger of them living like that. And so that's not even a productive thing to think about. But people on their own can take whatever small steps they can. It can all be very incremental, one step at a time. And I talk about that in the book. The book presents a method that can be used for just about anything technology related to gain more control and to reduce your dependence, to become more autonomous, to gain free time, to take the initiative.
Yeah, and it's absolutely worth pointing out that we're not being anti-technology here at all. It's about how technology is used and how it uses us. You even have a section when you're dealing with it towards the end of the book. You're talking about something called anti-technology technology. This is not to go back to the Stone Age. It's just to sort of have a suite of technologies that serve us and that are useful and that are resilient. I particularly like your emphasis on the quality of the build of things, this built-in obsolescence that we have now and stuff that you can't fix and that, it breaks after a year and because it's so cheap to replace, blah, blah, blah. It was only a couple of generations ago that people would take things like, washing machines if they had them, refrigerators if they had them, certainly cars, and they'd repair them, they'd wear out, they'd break, they'd repair them again, and that's, the fact that you can't do that anymore with so many things is kind of telling.
Well, there are things that you can do that with. For instance, horse-drawn farm implements. A lot of them are over 100 years old. They break and they get welded together again and they get used again. So we do have technology, various types of heirloom technology that was designed to last for ages. It's just that we have to make a conscious decision to to get rid of the tractor and use draft horses instead. And, we won't be able to raise cash crops that way, but we'll be able to feed ourselves and our neighbors.
That's it. Not falling backward, but a conscious step backward in order to go forward. Although I think more than anything technological, logistical or physical, as a hurdle this change is going to be toughest as psychological.
Well, everything that has been deemed as a sort of technological progress has actually gone in just one direction, applying more power, applying more centralization, applying more control. And so it's not a step back. It's a step forward towards greater freedom, greater independence. It is all somewhat more difficult because when you apply power, you don't need as much skill. If you have less power, you need more skill, and people don't have the skill because they're now used to pushing buttons. They don't have the mental aptitude to live a completely manual lifestyle anymore. They've lost it. And so that is something that needs to be brought back one piece of technology at a time.
And this reflects conversations I've had with younger people, typically a generation younger. To the extent that they're willing to really think about the future, I say to them, learn to do something that's actually productive and useful in the real world. Many so-called jobs which currently depend on or serve the technosphere will be going away in the years to come, so consider how 10 or 20 years from now you might be able to make the difference between survival and collapse for you and yours, and by extension, for your communities as a whole.
Yes, well, the greatest frontier is the family, because what the technosphere wants to do is basically breed a race of technocrats. And so children are pushed into technical professions, whether they want them or not. And then everybody's kept in school till they're too old to have children in a lot of cases. And if you look at it, developed countries are depopulating for that very reason, because of education. You can't raise a family and get advanced degrees and get all the credentials you need to become a professional. And so a big part of the solution is basically find a way to stay out of debt while raising a family while you're still young. That's the challenge to a lot of people, because otherwise they'll end up childless, unemployed, and broke and alone. So they're being walked down the garden path that goes to nowhere, goes to a cement wall. And they have to figure out that that's happening. And then an additional problem is, there's an entire system, educational system, designed to corrupt and enslave the minds of the young, starting from a young age. They're being taught all sorts of things that just aren't true. And so a lot of people are starting to homeschool. Of course, if you homeschool, then you can't work as much because you're spending a lot of time schooling your children, teaching them everything they need to know. But a lot of people are doing it anyway, and that takes a lot of skill again. How to survive with a smaller income, less work, how to consume less, how to do more for yourself. But a lot of people are actually accepting that challenge.
Your book is full of ideas in this area, but just a last thought on this particular aspect of the situation. And with a lot of people I talk to, particularly people that I mentioned earlier, people I know, have friends that I've known for quite a long time, some of whom have kids. Two things. One is they say all of what you and I have been discussing today, they find difficult to go there. It's partly because they have kids. It's like, well, they can't hear me talking like this. They're optimistic. They want what we have.
Well, there isn't anything in general that can be said. There is no trick, no solution. It all just takes hard work. But there are small steps that can be taken. For instance, one of the things that's wrong about developed countries and quote unquote civilized societies is that children are considered useless. They're just basically there to play, be taught, and be entertained, but they're not to be allowed to do any work. And that is entirely unnatural. So if you start doing lots of things within the household, if you cook 3 meals a day from scratch every day, as families around the world have done for thousands of years, and you allow the kids to contribute to the process, whatever it is, going out to the kitchen garden, picking vegetables, plucking a chicken, whatever, you end up with kids that have much more of a sense of how the world actually works. They know where stuff comes from. They know how things happen. And just a little bit of that is enough to push them away from this world where they just are entertained by pushing buttons, where they're destined to become completely useless once those buttons stop doing anything.
Closing thought. You've disengaged in many ways from the technosphere, and yet in many ways you're still engaged. Here we are, after all. Are you an optimist or a pessimist, or is the situation simply too fluid to say for sure?
Well, I do what I can, and I think I'm a realist. And it turns out that there's quite a lot that I can do, and I'm actually doing it, and so far so good. So I'll continue.
Well, Dmitry, today we've been discussing your latest book, Shrinking the Technosphere, getting a grip on the technologies that limit our autonomy, self-sufficiency and freedom. That's widely available, but perhaps you'd like to let listeners know about your website and any other resources that you'd like to share.
Yes, the 2 projects that I keep up is my blog, which is Club Orlov, ORLOV, .blogspot.com, and I generally publish every Tuesday. I think I may not have anything for this Tuesday, but in general, every Tuesday I publish an essay. And also I'm working on a project where we designed a sailboat that's also a houseboat. And unlike the commercially available offerings, this boat is inexpensive, very durable, and designed not for ostentation or recreation, but for actually living aboard comfortably as a family. And so we're going to actually try to build one later this year, full scale. So far, we've only done it in software and scale model, but we're going to actually build a full-size hull, hopefully later this year, and that's called Quidnon, which is Latin for why not, as in why not build such a boat. And there's a blog for it too, quidnon.blogspot.com.
Dmitry Orlov, thank you so much for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.